Marshall was a kind of poor business. George at one point offended his father. When thumbing through a history of the Marshall family, he fastened on the pirate Blackbeard, husband of one of the ancestral Marshall women, as the only interesting character in the work, and boasted to his classmates about his raffish forebear. But if indifferent to his own pedigree, George was susceptible to the Virginia myth as a force for molding character and personality. In reality, from the outset, the settlers of colonial Virginia and their descendants enjoyed a mixed reputation, one that included proclivities for hard drinking, boisterous sports, reckless gambling, and heedless extravagance. But at its best, the ideal of Virginian shaped a code of values and behavior that appended pride with honor, grace, and integrity that George somehow absorbed on the road to adulthood. Among those who seriously practiced what they preached, it included a love of place and country, an exalted standard of personal honor and public rectitude, an avoidance of overt self-serving, and a respect for women, children, and the weak. Alas, in George's case, it also discounted humor. Many people had words of high praise for Marshall over the years, but few ever called him funny. Years later, when he presided over his country's military operations in the greatest war in history, a colleague in the War Department recalled his manner of giving orders. He was a demanding man, innate, Colonel Frank MacArthur later told an interviewer. There was nothing except take this and do this and so on and yes, sir. Never with humor, never with warmth, but with correctness and politeness. Few of the published pictures of Marshall show him with a smile on his face. For George, as a boy, the Virginian myth was steeped in the special mystique of George Washington. Close to his Uniontown home was Fort Necessity, where in 1754 the French had defeated the young lieutenant colonel of the Virginia militia sent to oust them during what became a dress rehearsal for the French and Indian War. When he was 7, George's father took him on a memorable tour of the fort, then in ruins. In 1957, in his first interviews with his biographer, Forrest Pogue, Marshall seemed almost obsessed with Washington and his early military exploits. It is not surprising that as he evolved into an adult, George would borrow the attributes of his childhood hero and make them his own. Interestingly, Washington's own self-creation had foreshadowed George's. According to his recent biographer, Ron Chernow, the father of his country tended his image with extreme care. He trained himself to play the gentleman in polite drawing rooms. People sensed something a bit studied about his behavior. Chernow says that Washington's model was the British aristocracy, as he perceived it before the Revolution, but Marshall, in his turn, learned much of what manhood meant or should mean from Washington directly. One telling instance of imitation was Marshall's devotion to horseback riding. The first president was famous for his superb horsemanship, and it appears likely that Marshall's almost compulsive attachment to riding was inspired by his great predecessor. Marshall's exposure to noble Virginians and their attributes intensified at Virginia Military Institute, where George would receive his military training as a young man. At VMI in Marshall's day, the Civil War victories of Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson in the Valley Campaign at Antietam and at Fredericksburg remained heroic legends. His classmates at the Institute, moreover, were predominantly Southerners, many from the wealthier classes who cherished and emulated the Virginia type. Reinforcement came from that still more famous Virginia general, Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia and General-in-Chief of the Confederate Army. After the South's surrender at Appomattox in 1865, Lee had settled in Lexington, adjacent to VMI, to serve as president of Washington College. He was a potent presence, both literally and figuratively, in Marshall's early manhood. And then, to further strengthen the Virginia affinity, there was Marshall's first wife and her family. Lily Coles was descended from a long line of Virginia gentry. Her mother, Elizabeth Childs Pendleton Coles, a member of the FFV, whose forebears included a signer of the Declaration of Independence, harped on her ancestry. As Marshall later recalled, she was a very ardent Virginian, who thought that the name Uniontown sounded rather common and was rather ashamed of where I came from. Marshall claimed that his mother-in-law's pretensions amused him, but they could not have failed to reinforce his sense of how important the Virginia connection was